Imagine stepping into a London anatomical theater in the year 1784. The smell of copper and decay hits first, thick and metallic, filling your lungs and pressing on your chest. Candlelight flickers over bodies frozen in impossible positions, eyes glimmering as though they remember the moment of their deaths. Rusted scalpels hover above tables, twitching as if eager to carve not flesh but your very memory. Shadows stretch and twist into shapes that should not exist, and when you reach for a table, a warm hand grips yours from beneath the wood, alive, insistent, refusing to let go. Every breath you take is no longer your own. The theater has claimed a piece of you, folding you into centuries of observation, fear, and inevitability. By the time the candle dies, you realize with horror, no one ever leaves this place whole. The smell hit first, thick and metallic, curling into the lungs with a persistence that made every breath an effort. It clung to the damp stone walls and the warped wooden floors as though the building itself exhaled centuries of decay, a slow, deliberate respiration that pressed against the chest and filled the head with a dizzying, coppery haze. The London Anatomical Theatre in the year 1784 seemed alive in ways that logic could not account for, pulsing with a rhythm beneath each step, a heartbeat measured not by the clock, but by the silent, watchful presence of the bodies laid upon the tables. Candlelight quivered over skin drawn taut across ribs, over the pale, waxen flesh that shimmered with an uncanny moisture, and eyes that should have been empty glimmered as though aware of the intruders who dared to enter, reflecting not only what had been, but what might have been. Instruments lined the walls and tables in meticulous, grim arrays, scalpels, hooks, saws, each coated with rust and residue, yet quivering with a preternatural intent, as if eager to carve not flesh but memory itself, to inscribe terror into the very marrow of those who observed. The air vibrated with whispers too faint to discern, half-words that drifted along the ceiling beams and into the corners where shadows pooled unnaturally, thickening into shapes that bore no resemblance to anything living or dead, shapes that twisted and folded with a patience that made the floorboards tremble underfoot. The tables stretched endlessly, a forest of iron legs and scarred wood, each bearing a body frozen in positions that suggested awareness, a lingering impression of life that refused to be extinguished. Fingers curled as if trying to clutch at something unseen, toes flexed in silent warnings, jaws parted in eternal half-screams that resonated in the ears long after the eyes adjusted. The smell of burnt oil and decayed flesh mingled with the faint, cloying sweetness of organs left too long beneath flickering candles, a scent that clung to hair and clothing, embedding itself in memory as though the theater demanded acknowledgement of its presence. Students long dead had left traces, the subtle imprint of eyes wide in fascination and horror, faces mirrored in the pallid, twitching forms of the corpses, every expression a reflection of terror and curiosity intertwined. The walls themselves seemed to lean inward slightly, drawing attention to corners where shadows moved independently, slithering along beams and across floors, occasionally coalescing into silhouettes that mimicked the living, yet never perfectly, always subtly distorted, always watching. Candle flames trembled as if uncertain, their light caught on the curve of a rib, the hollow of an eye, the glint of rusted steel, highlighting the theater's careful choreography of fear and observation. Every step carried weight, not only of the visitor but of the countless hours, days, and years of study, dissection, and the silent recording of horror that had taken place here. Each body seemed to breathe in its own slow, deliberate rhythm, every twitch and shift a faint insistence that time was not linear within these walls, that life and death had intertwined in ways that could not be disentangled. The floorboards groaned underfoot, responding to the collective memory of the building, each crack and creak a whisper, a subtle vibration that pressed through shoes and into the spine. Shadows curled and elongated along the walls, pooling in corners like thick, sentient smoke, and the air carried a faint hum, the resonance of countless observations, countless lessons, countless deaths, pressing insistently against every nerve. It was a theater not merely of anatomy, but of knowledge fused with terror, a space that consumed awareness and returned it transformed, where the smell of iron, the touch of cold wood, and the sight of twitching flesh combined into a single, inescapable assertion. The living were merely spectators, and the dead had already claimed dominion over every inch of the room. Candlelight flickered once more, and for a moment the tables seemed to shift imperceptibly, bodies aligning as though for a lesson that had no audience, a demonstration meant for eyes that had long ceased to exist, and the theater exhaled in unison with the faint, coppery tang of inevitability that pressed against every inhalation. The tables stretched endlessly, a forest of iron legs and warped wood, each bearing a body that had been sacrificed to the pursuit of knowledge, to curiosity, to cruelty. Skin pale and slick reflected candlelight in uneven glimmers, and the muscles beneath twitched with subtle insistence, a rhythm that suggested memory, sensation, and thought long after the soul had departed. Fingers curled as if trying to clutch secrets that had been buried under layers of flesh and time, joints locking and unlocking in silent articulation, toes flexing in the same deliberate rhythm, as though warning anyone who dared approach of consequences too terrible to imagine. Jaws opened and closed slowly, eternally paused between scream and sigh, exposing teeth that had long since lost the warmth of life but retained a consciousness that vibrated through the room in faint, nauseating pulses. The air was thick with the scent of burnt oil, of iron, of decay, each inhalation carrying the latent sweetness of organs left too long under candlelight, their aroma mingling with the faint smokiness of candles whose wicks had long since blackened with use, leaving traces of soot that settled in the folds of the body's flesh, in the cracks of the floorboards, in the corners where shadows gathered and refused to disperse. Every breath, every pulse, every shift of light in the theater seemed to conspire with the remnants of the students who had once observed here, whose faces now lingered in memory and marrow, mirrored in the pallid, twitching forms of the corpses, each expression a reflection of awe and horror, curiosity intertwined with fear, a silent testament to the lessons learned and the lessons refused. The walls themselves were dense with presence, with the faint, almost imperceptible vibration of footsteps that had long since vanished into history, the groan of beams settling under centuries of weight, the subtle creak of boards that responded not only to the living but to the dead whose hands had pressed them down in anticipation or despair, whose knees had shivered with expectation, whose eyes had widened with the slow comprehension of mortality as finality. Shadows gathered and thickened, pooling unnaturally in corners and beneath tables, curling into forms that suggested awareness, that mimicked gestures of the living and yet never quite succeeded, always distorted, always watching, always present even when no one dared turn toward them. The scalpel, once a tool of precision, now hovered with intent, trembled in the candlelight as if anticipating a hand that would never come, poised to carve not flesh but memory, to open veins of recollection in those who gazed too long, too deeply, who inhaled too greedily the scent of iron and smoke and decay. The bodies on the tables were not merely inert. They existed in a suspended state where past, present, and potential overlapped, where the knowledge of centuries and the terror of discovery coalesced into a single, unrelenting assertion of presence. Every twitch of a finger was a word, every flex of a foot a sentence, every half-open jaw a line of communication written in the language of fear, transmitted across space and time to anyone who dared to enter. The floors beneath were damp with condensation that reflected the flickering candlelight in distorted, fractal patterns, each reflection a map of movements that had never been, or perhaps would never be, each puddle an archive of sensation and memory that pressed upward into the soles of shoes and into the knees, tugging at the spine with the subtle insistence of inevitability. Students long dead had left behind traces more persistent than any ink or paper. Their fascination, their terror, their recognition of their own inadequacy lingered in the air, folded into the fabric of the theater, absorbed into the pores of the wood and stone. Every motion of a corpse seemed deliberate, as though guided by the same invisible hands that had guided the scalpel, each twitching limb an echo of centuries of observation, each flicker of muscle a lesson in the inescapable consequences of curiosity. The walls breathed, subtly, imperceptibly at first, then with an increasing insistence, contracting and expanding, exhaling the combined weight of terror, knowledge, and the persistent memory of all who had ever stood upon the creaking floorboards, forcing the living to sense not only their own presence but the record of presence itself, the accumulation of hundreds of lifetimes pressed into stone and wood and iron. The shadows that curled along the walls sometimes detached entirely, floating for a moment in midair, forming humanoid shapes that mimicked gestures, movements, postures, expressions, each an uncanny reflection of the observer, yet distorted, grotesque, insistent in their silent assertion of dominance over perception. Candle flames flickered in response to these presences, elongating the body's shadows, twisting them into impossible angles that suggested a geometry of fear beyond comprehension, a pattern that resonated in the bones of those who watched, forcing awareness to stretch, to bend, to dissolve. The smell grew heavier, layered with the sweetness of decay, the acrid tang of iron, the subtle smoke of candle wicks and burnt oil, each inhalation filling the throat and chest with a weight that pressed on the ribs and slowed the heartbeat, a rhythm that synchronized slowly with the pulses of the corpses, until living and dead moved in tandem whether they would or not. The theater recorded each movement, each shift of posture, each slight change in expression, absorbing it into the memory of the walls, the tables, the floors, the very air itself, cataloging the terror and fascination of observers so that the theater's knowledge grew with every visit, every glance, every involuntary shiver that ran along the spine. Limbs twitched in tandem with shadows. Shadows mirrored motions before they occurred. Reflections in puddles formed impossible duplications of bodies and faces, all of it coalescing into a slow, deliberate choreography of fear and observation that no one could escape or fully comprehend. The room seemed to fold in on itself, corners stretching and compressing, tables shifting subtly in the periphery of vision, instruments rising ever so slightly, as though lifted by unseen fingers, until the living could no longer distinguish what was tangible from what existed solely in memory, in shadow, in the residual will of the dead. Every breath drawn within the theater was counted, measured, absorbed, and echoed back in sensations of copper, wrought, and iron, pressing insistently into every nerve ending, leaving the visitor aware that each step, each glance, each heartbeat was no longer their own, that they had become part of the theater, another note in its ceaseless archive, another twitching, silent voice among the endless chorus of observation and terror. By the stroke of midnight, the theater shifted imperceptibly, as if the walls themselves had drawn a deep, deliberate breath. Floorboards groaned beneath weight that had no owner, the sound resonating through the knees and spine of anyone who moved, vibrating up into the chest with the subtle insistence of something alive, yet invisible. The walls flexed, contracting and expanding in slow, deliberate pulses, corners folding into themselves, swallowing shadows, swallowing space, leaving the eyes unsure whether they were looking at an empty void or a threshold into some alternate dimension of the theater itself. Candlelight flickered erratically, catching on surfaces in unpredictable ways, illuminating muscles that twitched beneath pallid skin, eyes that reflected not the present but overlapping fragments of past lessons, past observers, past lives. In the shallow puddles that gathered on warped wooden floors, reflections shimmered in impossible geometries, showing bodies that could not exist, torsos stretched beyond human measure, limbs bending in angles forbidden by anatomy, faces of students and professors merged into grotesque, multi-layered masks, eyes blinking in unison or rolling independently in a rhythm that mocked comprehension. The air was dense, heavy with the coppery scent of blood long dried, with the sweet, cloying rot of organs, with the acrid tang of burnt oil from candles that had sputtered for decades, and it vibrated faintly with whispers too subtle for the tongue to form, carrying knowledge and accusation both. The scalpel lifted from the table on its own, a small, deliberate motion that cleaved the air with invisible precision, tilting and shifting as though guided by some unseen hand, poised to cut not flesh but the memory embedded in the bodies, the air, the floorboards, slicing through layers of time and expectation with surgical intent. Corpses twitched, not in chaotic spasms but in the slow, purposeful articulation of something rehearsed endlessly, muscles stretching and flexing in deliberate choreography, toes curling, fingers reaching toward something just beyond perception, jaws parting to form soundless syllables that vibrated in the ears and chest of the living. They shuffled across tables, some descending to the floor, limbs dragging with wet, sticky resistance, forming lines, spirals, and tableaus that conveyed lessons older than anyone present could name, a history written not in ink but in movement, in memory, in the undeniable presence of what had been sacrificed to knowledge. The theater itself seemed to fold around them, corridors bending, doors appearing where none had existed before, corners doubling back on themselves, ceilings lowering and rising imperceptibly, walls tilting toward observers with a weight that pressed against ribs, urging the living into awareness of their own smallness within the design. Every surface pulsed subtly, the wood beneath shoes flexing in rhythm with the bodies, the stone walls contracting around the shadows, the puddles reflecting shapes that moved faster or slower than their corporeal counterparts, stretching minutes into hours, hours into centuries, until the heartbeat of the theater became indistinguishable from the heartbeat of the living, until the notion of self dissolved into the ambient presence of accumulated observation. Shadows detached entirely from corners and walls, rising slowly in curling ribbons, forming humanoid shapes that hovered, imitated, mirrored, and distorted the movements of the living, circling observers with patience and precision, feeding off hesitation, breathing, and the subtle tremor of curiosity mixed with dread. The candlelight caught on these forms in brief, blinding flashes, revealing the musculature of bodies that should not have been, the glint of eyes that never belonged to a single individual, the suggestion of fingers that traced and retracted, leaving impressions in air and memory simultaneously. The air carried the subtle, almost electric hum of anticipation, vibrating against eardrums, pressing into the lungs, curling around limbs, and dragging awareness into itself, a slow tide that pulled the living into the rhythm of the corpses, of the walls, of the theater's deliberate, unyielding consciousness. Every twitch, every flex, every involuntary shiver was recorded, catalogued, and returned, the theater absorbing it and shaping it into new patterns, new lessons, new reflections of horror that would appear moments or decades later, sometimes overlapping, sometimes diverging, always deliberate. The bodies on the tables seemed to remember every lesson they had ever been made to teach, reenacting motions that spanned generations of students, each twitch a syllable, each shift a paragraph, each glance a story folded into the memory of the theater itself, written not on paper, but in the sinew and bones of the living and the dead alike. Steps taken by visitors became entangled with these motions, each footfall reverberating through the floors and walls, echoed back as subtle pressure, as tugging at joints, as an invisible hand guiding, judging, recording. Limbs reached out, sometimes brushing the living, sometimes passing through them as though they were not entirely real, leaving a residue of cold, of iron, of coppery weight, a reminder that presence itself had been claimed by the theater. Doors appeared and disappeared at the edge of vision, corridors extended and contracted, the geometry of the room bending around awareness rather than logic, forming loops that fed into one another, leaving observers to step where they had already stepped, yet never quite retracing their own path. The scalpel moved again, carving arcs in air that shimmered briefly, leaving a faint trace of light in the wake, a pattern of intent that the mind struggled to decipher, a lesson in inevitability that pressed insistently against perception, demanding acknowledgement, submission, comprehension. Puddles reflected not only bodies but entire sequences of motion, histories compressed into water and shadow, stretching the perception of minutes into a span of centuries, overlapping all who had ever entered and all who would enter, layering past and present and potential into a single, continuous loop of awareness, terror, and education. The theater exhaled as one entity, a long, measured, deliberate breath that pressed outward into the chest and mind, carrying the smell of iron, of burnt oil, of organs and decay, mingled with the almost sweet perfume of fear and fascination, a scent that embedded itself in every nerve, bone, and memory. Every twitch, every movement, every subtle reflection reminded the living that here, in this theater, the dead were no longer passive, the walls no longer inert, and observation was no longer optional. Time, space, perception, and anatomy coalesced into a single, unrelenting statement. The theater breathed, remembered, and judged, and all who remained within its walls were already a part of its ceaseless lesson. A body rose fully, joint by joint, wet with condensation that smelled of iron, sweat, and the faint sweetness of decay, each movement deliberate, slow, as though rehearsed 1,000 times before it was ever witnessed. The limbs flexed and extended with an uncanny awareness, dragging across the warped wooden floors in patterns that echoed those of students long dead, forms that had once bent over tables now bending beneath the invisible weight of centuries. Others followed, sliding from tables with sickly, sticky sounds that clung to ears, leaving traces of moisture that carried the metallic tang of blood and the acrid scent of burnt oil. The air vibrated subtly, charged with a presence that was neither living nor dead, suspended in the liminal space between memory and reality, a delicate tension that pressed against every nerve ending, pulling awareness outward as though the theater itself were stretching perception like taffy. Shadows pooled and thickened along the walls, curling around corners, coiling across floors, forming humanoid silhouettes that mimicked motion yet distorted it, creating impossible postures, gesticulations, and expressions that suggested knowledge no human could possess. Candlelight flickered over slick skin, highlighting sinews, ribs, and knuckles, glinting against the edges of rusted scalpels and hooks that hovered momentarily before shifting in perfect coordination with each twitching limb. The theater exhaled slowly, a deep, resonant pulse that pressed into chests, tugged at spines, and synchronized the heartbeat of the living with the rhythm of bodies that should have been still, bodies that moved with the patience of centuries, articulating lessons that had no names and histories that refused to remain linear. Every movement seemed both personal and universal. A hand lifted toward the ceiling yet dragged the observer into a memory not their own. A foot flexed but left impressions in the floorboards that were immediately overwritten by an echo of another step, perhaps centuries old, perhaps not yet taken. The smell of copper, old blood, and incense swirled in thick layers, clinging to hair, clothing, and skin, embedding itself into memory with the insistence of inevitability, pressing awareness into the small, vulnerable space between the living and the recorded dead. Limbs reached for one another, sometimes connecting, sometimes passing through, leaving a sensation of cold, of weight, of contact that had never occurred, of pressure that existed only in perception, a phantom feedback loop that left every observer unsure where their body ended and the theater began. Puddles of water on the floor reflected impossible sequences of motion, bodies folding into one another, twisting and reforming into grotesque mosaics of memory and anticipation, every reflection a document of time collapsed, centuries compressed into single moments, past, present, and potential overlapping in ways that defied comprehension. The bodies were not simply performing. They were demonstrating, teaching a language written in sinew, in shadow, in the tension between bone and air, articulating lessons about inevitability, consequence, and the persistence of awareness beyond life. Shadows sometimes detached fully, hovering above the floor, stretching and curling into shapes that mimicked hands, faces, torsos, each movement synchronized with the living yet subtly divergent, a silent assertion of control, a constant insistence that observation was no longer optional. Candle flames shivered as if afraid, elongating reflections across walls and floors, highlighting the twitching musculature of bodies that should have been inert, revealing eyes that gleamed with impossible recognition, that seemed to track the intruder with knowledge accumulated over lifetimes. The theater itself flexed in tandem, walls pulsing inward and outward, ceilings dipping and rising in time with the measured rhythm of the animated bodies, doors appearing and disappearing at the periphery of vision, corridors folding in on themselves, looping endlessly, drawing the living into a choreography that was at once subtle and overwhelming. Every inhalation carried the weight of centuries. Every exhalation transmitted it outward, a tangible pressure that pressed on the chest, the lungs, the sinuses, saturating thought with inevitability. The scalpel hovered again, slicing arcs through the damp air, leaving no mark on flesh but tracing patterns that resonated in perception, an invisible ink written across the observer's awareness, encoding lessons in precision, patience, and the inescapable authority of the theater itself. Limbs moved in perfect, deliberate coordination, wrists flexing, elbows bending, shoulders rolling in sequences that mirrored instruction yet twisted it into forms the living could not replicate, creating a visual language that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. Each step taken by a visitor pressed against this choreography, altered it subtly, yet never escaped it. The theater absorbed hesitation and curiosity alike, folding them into the rhythm of motion, converting awareness into another node in the network of observation that had existed for decades, for centuries. Shadows twisted, reflected, multiplied in puddles and on walls, forming tableaus that repeated with subtle variation, each iteration a refinement of memory, a layering of observation, a deliberate rehearsal of horror and knowledge intertwined. Muscles tensed and relaxed across the theater in waves, bodies on tables, on floors, in reflections, in shadows, synchronizing in ways imperceptible yet undeniable, until the living felt themselves dragged into history they had never known, into lessons they had not consented to learn, into a space where mortality and memory intertwined with inevitability. The air itself seemed to hum with recognition, vibrating against skin, bones, and hair, transmitting the weight of the theater into the nervous system of all who lingered, leaving a sense that movement was no longer voluntary, that hesitation was impossible, that every action had already been observed and catalogued, measured and absorbed. Bodies twisted, shadows rose, puddles reflected the impossible, candlelight trembled and shadows danced, and through it all, the theater breathed in deliberate, unrelenting rhythm, folding the living into the choreography, pressing awareness into muscle and sinew, teaching a lesson that could not be ignored, and by the hour of one, all present realized that the distinction between self and theater had dissolved, leaving only motion, memory, and the persistent, coppery scent of inevitability hanging in the damp air. By dawn, the theater had become unrecognizable, a landscape of warped geometry and suspended perception, where tables stacked at impossible angles, leaning upon one another with the weightless certainty of centuries, their surfaces slick with condensation that smelled of iron, burnt oil, and the faint, sickly sweetness of decomposition. Instruments gleamed as if polished by invisible hands, hooks arched in silent anticipation, scalpels curved unnaturally, and saws hovered above the floor in delicate arcs that suggested both menace and instruction, each reflecting candlelight in ways that defied logic and physics, catching on veins, sinews, and the taut, pale skin of bodies that had long ceased to belong to life. Shadows detached fully from their sources, curling and twisting across walls, floors, and ceilings, forming shapes at once familiar and grotesque, humanoid yet impossible, dancing in slow, deliberate patterns that mirrored the movements of the corpses while simultaneously contradicting them, suggesting that the theater itself had claimed authority over both time and anatomy. The corpses moved in grotesque synchrony, a choreography of centuries compressed into a single hour, flexing, twisting, and contorting in lessons long forgotten by the living, recreating deaths, dissections, discoveries, and failures as if the entirety of anatomical knowledge had been folded into the sinew and bones, ready to be observed by anyone who dared to enter. Every twitch of a hand, every curling of a toe, every flex of a neck was deliberate, precise, a language written not in words but in motion, in shadow, in the subtle vibration of air that pressed against skin and bone alike, resonating with a rhythm that was neither wholly alive nor entirely dead. Puddles of water across the floor reflected sequences of movement that could not exist in the natural world, images folding upon images, each layer a palimpsest of previous lessons, previous observers, previous deaths, and in each reflection the living saw themselves refracted, multiplied, altered, their own motions co-opted by the theater, traced in slow, deliberate echoes across the damp wooden floor. The air was thick with copper, iron, burnt candle wax, and the faintly sweet, acrid scent of long-dried organs, a perfume that clung to hair, clothing, and skin, embedding itself into memory with insidious persistence, pressing awareness into the small, vulnerable space between life and observation, between motion and instruction. Every heartbeat of a visitor was mirrored and measured by the theater, absorbed into the rhythm of bodies that should have been inert, catalogued alongside centuries of previous observers, layered with the pulses of those who had once bent over tables, scalpels in hand, and had shivered in the presence of truth too vast for comprehension. Limbs reached for one another and passed through each other, leaving a residue of cold pressure, a ghostly insistence that the living were now participants in a performance they had not chosen, a rehearsal of inevitability where hesitation itself was impossible. Candle flames shivered violently, elongating shadows that intertwined with the moving bodies, highlighting faces that flickered between recognition and grotesque distortion, reflecting eyes that had witnessed centuries, that had accumulated knowledge, terror, and memory, and that now observed the living as though assessing their worth. Corridors bent and twisted around perception, doors appeared where none should exist, corners vanished into themselves, and ceilings sagged only to stretch upward in impossible arcs, creating a labyrinthine architecture in constant negotiation with presence, awareness, and fear. The scalpel rose and fell in invisible arcs, tracing patterns through air that left no wound on flesh, yet inscribed a mark on consciousness, a deliberate geometry of terror that resonated in the chest, in bones, and in the nervous system, embedding comprehension through sensation rather than cognition. Puddles reflected not only the corporeal forms but entire sequences of actions, movements compressed from decades into seconds, history folded into a single, continuous demonstration, a lesson that could not be ignored, a narrative of life, death, discovery, and failure presented in visual, kinetic, olfactory, and emotional dimensions simultaneously. Shadows formed tableaus of dissection and death, reenacting mistakes and revelations, mistakes that had killed students or corrupted understanding, lessons that had been forgotten yet persisted in sinew and muscle, reinforced by observation, by repetition, by the very architecture of the theater. Every inhalation carried the weight of centuries. Every exhalation transmitted it outward, saturating the room with the insistence of awareness beyond life, a rhythm that tugged at spines, pressed into ribs, and curled around nerves, drawing the living into participation in a ritual of observation and memory that had no end. Time and space collapsed under the theater's authority, minutes stretching into hours, hours into decades, decades into centuries, until the distinction between self and space, between living and remembered, had vanished entirely. Bodies moved, shadows danced, reflections multiplied endlessly, and the air itself seemed to pulse with the accumulated knowledge, terror, and inevitability of all who had ever entered, leaving anyone who remained within no longer a visitor but a note in a composition orchestrated by the theater itself, a measure in a symphony that only the building understood, a presence absorbed into the deliberate, unyielding memory of centuries. Every heartbeat, every shiver, every twitch became a point in this composition, resonating outward into the walls, the ceilings, the puddles, the shadows, and through it all, the theater breathed with patient precision, a living repository of instruction and terror, folding all who remained within its walls into the inexorable rhythm of its ceaseless observation, until nothing remained outside its will, and by the hour of dawn, the living could no longer discern whether they were observers, participants, or simply echoes within a structure that had long since ceased to be inert. When the final candle guttered, its flame collapsing into a thin, trembling wisp of smoke, the theater fell into a silence so complete it pressed against the ears, the throat, the ribs, as though sound itself had been absorbed into the walls over centuries of observation. The bodies froze mid-motion, limbs locked in impossible angles, hands suspended above floors slick with condensation that smelled of iron, burnt wax, and the faintly sweet rot of long-dead organs, yet the air remained heavy, dense with a lingering weight that pressed downward into the chest and coiled around the spine of the living. One visitor reached out to steady themselves against a table, the surface slick with the residue of 1,000 lessons, and a hand emerged from beneath the wood, warm, insistent, and undeniably alive, grasping their wrist with a strength that was neither human nor fully mechanical, a fusion of intent that refused separation. The visitor jerked back instinctively, but the hand did not release. Instead, it seemed to grow into their flesh, melding sinew and bone with a quiet, inexorable patience, as though the theater had claimed a permanent share of their corporeal existence. Panic surged, a tide of dread pressing every thought into the narrow channel of survival. Yet no struggle altered the outcome. Muscles and joints were slowly overridden by a rhythm older than the visitor's own heartbeat, a tempo that resonated with the accumulated motion, observation, and terror of centuries. Their gaze fell to a puddle darkened with the residue of water and decay, and there, reflected in the warped, trembling surface, their own face had become a mosaic of every corpse that had ever rested upon the tables. Jaws agape in silent screams, eyes fixed in eternal recognition, hands curling toward futures never lived, limbs flexing in lessons too vast and too old to be comprehended in a single lifetime. Copper and rot hung thickly in the air, pressing into nostrils, lungs, and hair, embedding themselves into memory as though inhalation alone could rewrite the self, until perception itself became unreliable, every sense subject to the deliberate, patient manipulations of the theater. As the visitor's awareness folded upon itself, the room began to shift subtly. Tables tilted imperceptibly, shadows stretched and detached from bodies, coiling like serpents across walls and floors. Doors appeared where none should exist, and ceilings bowed in impossible arcs, creating the impression that the architecture itself was breathing in deliberate, patient rhythm with the trapped consciousness of the living and the recorded movements of the dead. Limbs that had once been separate from the observer now intertwined with their own, every twitch of muscle mirrored, every flex of a joint anticipated, until the visitor could no longer discern the boundary between their flesh and the accumulated presence of all who had been studied, dissected, and catalogued in the theater. Candle flames shivered as though in fear, elongating shadows that merged with bodies frozen in impossible postures, while the echoes of steps, long since ended, replayed softly in the corners of perception, pressing insistently against the chest, ribs, and spine, a delicate but unrelenting reminder that every breath, every heartbeat, every small movement had already been recorded, observed, and folded into the architecture of inevitability. The visitor's skin prickled as more hands emerged from tables, from puddles, from shadows, each grasping, each tethering, each pressing awareness into the inexorable rhythm of the theater, until motion itself felt borrowed from centuries of instruction, cruelty, and observation. Puddles reflected sequences of movement that stretched and folded time, hands reaching for scalpel slicing through air that had never been solid, eyes widening in horror, mouths opening in silent pleas, yet the observer felt none of this as mere performance, but as a direct, unescapable connection, each reflection a lesson written in sinew, memory, and fear. The walls pulsed faintly, contracting and expanding with the collective heartbeat of all who had ever entered. The floors vibrated in resonance with bodies frozen and bodies remembered. Shadows shifted with patience and deliberation, all synchronized to a rhythm older than language, older than law, older than life itself. The visitor realized in slow, creeping horror that no one could enter the theater without leaving pieces behind, a hand, a thought, a fragment of awareness, a portion of soul willingly or not surrendered to the patient accumulation of the building, absorbed into its deliberate memory until identity itself became malleable, negotiable, a resource to be cataloged alongside sinew, shadow, and reflection. The sense of inevitability pressed further, unrelenting, as the mosaic of faces in the puddles blinked in unison, jaws parting, eyes rolling, limbs flexing in a choreography that belonged simultaneously to the living, the dead, and the memory of all observers past, leaving the visitor caught in a space between horror and comprehension, unable to resist or withdraw. Copper, iron, burnt wax, and faint rot saturated every inhalation, embedding themselves into perception, reshaping understanding with each breath, until the visitor could not tell if the pulse in their chest was their own or borrowed from the rhythm of centuries of accumulated terror. As the candle flames finally guttered into nothingness, plunging the theater into darkness more complete than absence, the visitor felt themselves dissolve, folded into the mosaic, stretched across reflections, absorbed into sinew and shadow, until the theater had claimed them entirely. And in that darkness, thick with the scent of inevitability, the lesson became clear. No one left the London Anatomical Theatre of 1784 untouched, no one remained whole, and every step, every thought, every breath taken within its walls was a price paid in the currency of body, mind, and soul, forever inscribed in the patient, unyielding memory of the building itself.